All right, so let's go ahead and look at another example here of an immediate inference. And so in this one, we have, again, of course, one premise leading to a conclusion immediately. So we have all orcas are sea creatures, thus it is false that all sea creatures are orcas. And you will see problems just like this on exam 1, and of course in the textbook as well on Aplia, MindTap. And so just like we did in the previous example, we want to begin by doing Venn diagrams to determine if this is valid or invalid. Okay, so we want to start with our premise Venn diagram and then our conclusion Venn diagram. And so the premise then is going to get labeled according to the premise, subject, and predicate terms. And so we have orcas and we have sea creatures. And so we're going to have orcas and sea creatures. And here it's very important, as I said in the previous video, to make sure you label your conclusion Venn diagram exactly the same way as the premise. And so I'm going to have orcas on the left and sea creatures on the right. Now, again, in most cases, that'll simply be obvious, but here we can see that for the conclusion, sea creatures is actually the subject term, and orcas is the predicate term. Nonetheless, we need to label them in the same way because in the end, as we saw in the previous video, we're going to be comparing the two pictures to determine if this is a valid or invalid argument. So this is really important. Once you label the premise, label the conclusion exactly the same way. All right, so once we've done that, we can go ahead and look at our premise. All orcas are sea creatures, meaning if there are any orcas at all, they have to be sea creatures. And so we want to shade in this area to force any orcas there are into that middle area so they can also be sea creatures, right? Then we go to the conclusion. And in the conclusion, we see, oh yeah, it is false that, right? We're going to leave that aside to begin with, as we did in the previous video. And so we're going to diagram all sea creatures are orcas. So once again, when we have all as the quantifier, then we're going to shade, right? Because we're saying any sea creatures there are, if there were such a thing, they would have to be orcas. But now when we go to the conclusion Venn diagram, we see that the sea creatures are on the right-hand side. And so we have to shade that area to make sure that any sea creatures there are get pushed into the middle area. In other words, that they must be orcas as well. So that just comes from the shading here comes from the quantifier all. But now we don't forget about it is false that forever. Remember what we said in the previous video. When you have it is false that, the easy way to handle that is to, again, mark up the Venn diagram without considering that, and then just flip the marking to the other one. So in this case, we will erase carefully here the shading that I made and put an X in that area. So this says now it is false that all sea creatures are orcas. In other words, there is got to be a sea creature that's not an orca. Put the X there. So we've now diagrammed the information of both the premise and the conclusion. The pictures do not match, right, clearly. So the premise is not saying the same thing as the conclusion. And so the conclusion not guaranteed by the premise. And so as we see here, this is an invalid argument as we saw in the previous example. All right. Now, you will see this on, again, exam 1. You'll be given an immediate inference, and you'll be asked to determine if it's valid or invalid using both Venn diagrams and the square of opposition when applicable. However, in this case, the square of opposition is not applicable. I'm going to erase this, right, because this is not relevant anymore. But you wouldn't do that on the exam. You would leave your work so I could see that you know how to do this technique. But just to consider this here, we have the subject term in the premise is orcas. The subject term in the conclusion is sea creatures. They don't match. As soon as the subject does not match from the premise to the conclusion, or alternatively, if the predicate term does not match the predicate term in the conclusion, if you get a mismatch in either case, you cannot use the square of opposition. It only works when you're dealing with the corresponding statements with the same subject and predicate term from the premise to the conclusion. Now, in this case, obviously they're different. Orcas are not sea creatures and so forth. But as we'll see in upcoming videos, sometimes what can happen is you get a subject term that might be non-orcas, for example. Well, orcas and non-orcas are not the same thing. So again, they would not match. And then that particular immediate inference would not be eligible to use the square of opposition on, okay? So when this happens, you just don't use the square of opposition. You would just do the Venn diagrams as we just did to determine if they're valid or invalid. But in some cases, certainly, and maybe in many cases, when the subject and predicate terms match from the premise to the conclusion, you need to do both techniques, both the Venn diagram technique and the square of opposition technique.